Over the past almost 10 years, Halifax has been one of the fastest growing cities in Canada. The demand for housing has exploded, and with it, rents have skyrocketed. Many renters feel trapped, facing rent prices that seem out of control, and if they leave a place that's on the rent cap, then they're almost certain to face huge increases with their monthly payments. But is this the result of greedy landlords? Or is it a symptom of a larger issue within our housing system? Now, before I dig into this, if you're new here, my name is Andrew Stevens. I'm a realtor in Halifax. And if you want to be educated on the Halifax real estate market, then hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. And if you're currently renting and you want to get out of that market and into the housing market, you can reach out to me anytime in the Calendar link below. Now, in the media and in the comments section lately, landlords are getting a ton of hate. And while I do understand the hate towards the big bad landlord, as a lot of renters have had terrible experiences with landlords, and I have also had terrible experiences with landlords in my life in the past. And while there are obviously some bad apples out there, just like any other aspect in life, there's always going to be these types of people. But I'm here to tell you that not all landlords are rich. Not all landlords are unfair to their tenants. Not all landlords unfairly raise the rent. Not all landlords are slumlords or these big companies. There's a lot of everyday average Nova Scotians who are landlords who bought a property or maybe two that are hoping that this will become big savings for their retirement in the future. Now, to get a clear picture at what's happening, I think it's important to understand the overall market conditions. So let's look at the progression of rents over the last 5 years. In 2019, according to CMHC, the average two-bedroom apartment was about $1,200 a month. And there's a few numbers that I found online in terms of the most recent data, and if I take the average of those, it works out to about $2,500 a month right now. Now, if I look on Kijiji, sorted by Halifax and 20-kilometer radius, so I'm getting all of the suburbs as well. And if I look at the first 20 ads, the prices shown for two-bedroom apartments, the average of those is $2,355. So that's a real life value right now. And it seems that only 4 of those first 20 ads on Kijiji were under $2,000 a month. So you can imagine how many applications those specific landlords are getting. So rents have basically doubled in 5 years. And as we know, the wages in Halifax have certainly not doubled in the last 5 years. So people are really struggling with the cost of living as it's become extraordinarily expensive to live in Halifax and just in Nova Scotia in general. Let's not forget that this is all happening regardless of the fact that in November of 2020, the rent cap was implemented here, which basically means that a landlord can only do so much if you are already in a unit. This is now 5%, which started off as 2% max increases per year. So basically, if we're talking about a 2 to 5% rent cap and rents are basically doubling in a 5-year span, then it is obvious that this is not working. Now, I'm certainly not an economist, but I know that if you talk to most people, they will tell you that the rent cap is not going to work in the public favor for the long term. Now, I do understand why it was implemented in the first place during the pandemic, and I understand that once they kick that can down the road a little bit, it becomes harder and harder to take it off. So I understand why it was extended and increased to 5%. And that was sort of a happy medium that really nobody, whether it's a landlord or a tenant, was really happy with. But the harsh reality of it is this is also causing some maleffects in the market, such as landlords not treating their tenants great, such as landlords wanting their tenants to leave. So maybe some landlords are basically becoming slumlords because they don't want to spend any money on the property because their rental properties are no longer making money. And a lot of developers are trying to rent evict people so that they can get on with higher scale projects. So they need to get people out of those units so they can build more density with the recent zoning changes as well. In general, the housing situation is a complete mess in Nova Scotia with a huge housing shortage. The supply and demand are way out of whack. Recently, we've been adding 8 people to the province every year for every 1 unit of housing being built. So an 8-to-1 ratio. This was the second widest ratio in the country, only behind Moncton when these numbers came out last fall. So we're adding more and more people. We can't keep up with the demand, and we're not building nearly enough houses to keep up with the demand that we're currently seeing. So this is not a problem that's likely to get better anytime in the foreseeable future. In terms of newer units being brought to the market as new construction, the fact is the costs are astronomical. But ask yourself why. Well, a lot of that has to do with the labor shortage and material shortages and the overall cost of labor right now. There's a real lack of skilled trades in Halifax, but a big factor of this comes down to fees and taxes and permits, not to mention the overall timelines. So, the overall timelines being a huge problem for approvals on these new projects is a big deal because as the developer is ramping up to build a new building or they're in the permitting process or the development agreement process, they still have to carry this property. So if they just have a big piece of land sitting there they paid millions of dollars for, or maybe they have an underperforming set of flats that's there they're going to rip down to build a new building, this is all factored into their overall cost of building, and it's really, really expensive to build right now, which is exactly why these units are so expensive when they come to the market as new construction units and the rents are posted. It's insane. Like a two-bedroom unit being, $3,000 a month. It's absolutely insane. It's ludicrous, but that is where we're at right now. Now, in terms of those permits and the fees and so on, and the timelines, a lot of that has to do with the province and the municipalities themselves. And let's not forget, the province and the municipalities did not build any affordable housing units, any public housing units for 30 years. Yet somehow the developers and the landlords are taking a huge part of the blame for the lack of affordable housing. Not to mention, and this is something that does not get talked about very often in the news or in the media for obvious reasons, is that a lot of the buildings going up right now, let's take the Halifax Peninsula for example, were put forth initially for a development agreement 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or some of them as long as 20 years ago. They were declined for some stupid reason, whether it was the overall height or maybe it was the setbacks or something like that. And now, come today, these developers are now getting approval for these buildings with a much higher height and lesser setbacks. And it's a really tough question to ask, but here's the point I'm trying to make. What would our landscape look like today if most of these buildings were approved in a timely manner 5, 10, or 20 years ago? Just some food for thought for you. I don't know what that answer is, but it's something that I think about quite often when I'm looking at new developments that are coming to the market and I'm looking at the history of them and seeing that they were first brought forth in 2004 or 2008 or 2012. And here we are so far down the road, and the developer is getting more than what they wanted initially in the first place. Now, in terms of older units, for a lot of these landlords, the prices have gone up astronomically over the last 5 years, whether that's their mortgage payment based on the current rates, but not to mention all the other expenses have gone up as well, such as insurance, property taxes, utilities, and so on. Not to mention there's more fees from the municipality as well with the rental registry, and they took away short-term rentals, so that is affecting landlords and developers as well. Plus, if you're a landlord that has a unit that has a tenant in it pre-rent cap and now you're stuck with really low rents, that's not helping your cause of covering all your expenses either. So for example, let's say you bought a set of flats in 2017 in Halifax, and the tenants at the time were paying $1,200 or $1,400 a month for rent. And let's say that your mortgage just renewed a couple years ago at double the rate, which means your mortgage payment went way up, but you're stuck with the rent cap of these rents of $1,200 or $1,400 a month when maybe market rent today is $1,800, $2,000, or $2,200 a month. You're stuck with that, and it's becoming harder and harder to cover your expenses and to make money as a developer or as an investor or a rental property owner that's just kind of an average Joe or an average Nova Scotian. Now, in this particular example, the obvious benefit for these owners is that the property values have increased big time over the last 5 years. And I understand that. But at the same time, just because they made a sound investment and it's going really well, does that mean that they should cash out? Does it mean that they should sell? Because by the way, if they sell, it's not as likely to be bought by an investor the second time around, especially if it's only a 2 unit or a single family home. So because they made a good investment and maybe they could refinance it to cover their costs in the short term, that doesn't necessarily mean they should do it. If this was a long-term investment for retirement, they shouldn't be forced to cash out early just because of different government regulations coming into play and just because their expenses have gone up so much and they're locked into a unit with the rent cap. Think about it this way. If you put a bunch of money into an RRSP and you had a really good year, let's say your typical year is 6 to 8% return, and maybe you had a year that you had 20% returns, or maybe a couple years in a row that you had 20% returns. Does that mean you should pull that money out and go use it? Or would you rather keep it in there and be happy to know that it's there for your retirement? So, this is my point. Just because there's equity there doesn't mean they want to use it, because long term, it might not be the right idea for them. Not to mention, if they sell, they're looking at capital gains, and there's all these other things to consider. So it's not always just a case of, oh, well, they could just refinance and use their money to support the difference in the expenses versus the rent. It doesn't necessarily make sense. So at the end of the day, it's not that simple of an answer. Yes, they made a good investment. Yes, they have lots of equity there. No, they should not be punished for that just because they made a sound investment for their future. Now, a lot of these issues come down to the rates, which is going to start to level out a little bit as the rates are coming down. So hopefully that will help the overall situation. And as those rates come down, maybe the bill costs are relieved a little bit, and maybe that's going to help the overall situation. But we're so far behind now that it's going to take years and years to catch up and to get us into a better place in terms of the overall rental market in HRM. So back to the question at hand. Are Halifax landlords taking advantage of renters? And of course, in some cases, there's always the bad apples. So, sure, some of them are, no doubt, there's always idiots out there, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of them are simply trying to cover their expenses because they don't want to be out of pocket of their own personal money just to house somebody that they don't even know in a property that they own, which personally I would say is pretty fair. First of all, these landlords are private people or private companies, meaning they are investing to gain passive income for the future wealth of themselves or their family. It is not their mandate to fix the housing crisis, and quite frankly, it shouldn't be. We currently have a huge lack of housing in Halifax, but at the same time, the less appealing it is for developers and investors to invest in properties and to build more properties, the worse this situation will be. If we want the situation to change overall, we need more housing and we need it fast. And we cannot solve this without the private sector. We need the private sector building very quickly and in a big quantity to have any chance at turning around the overall housing crisis in our province and in Halifax. To me, it seems like the more and more the housing crisis has evolved, the more and more hate that's being thrown towards developers and landlords. And I get it. Again, I totally get it. But ask yourself, is this really their problem, or is this a bigger problem in general? Now, I remember back in 2016, 17, 18, when, let's use Larry Utech for an example. The developers up there were giving away a year's worth of internet and cable just to get tenants into their properties, as there was a huge vacancy problem in these properties. They were giving away maybe 3 months of free rent and so on. And now all of a sudden that coin has flipped, and developers can charge pretty much whatever they want for rental units because there's such a shortage, and tenants really have no choice but to pay, because if they won't, somebody else will. And this is part of the problem, is that supply and demand aspect. Again, nobody's perfect, and yes, everybody's had a bad experience with a landlord, and there's a lot of bad apples out there. But this is a very complex situation with many variables involved. And to say that it's all about the developers or these investors and the greedy landlords, this would be incorrect. Yes, this is part of the issue, no doubt, but the real issue is a rapidly growing city that's stretched way too thin with a huge lack of affordable housing that was brought on by several different factors, which personally I would consider to be sort of a perfect storm. What do you think? Are landlords in Halifax taking advantage of renters, or is this just the natural progression of the housing crisis in our city? Leave a comment below and let me know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more insights on Halifax real estate and our rapidly growing city. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support, and have a great day.